Ladies and gentlemen, the serious questions that can be raised about the conduct of the war in Vietnam would fill 100 printed pages. Of all these questions, however, there is one for which any American patriot has the right to demand a satisfactory and unequivocal explanation. Why fight 'em in Vietnam and help 'em everywhere else? Let's look at some of the facts and circumstances which make that question so inevitable and so important. First, we must realize that we are at war. Our president himself has said, "This is war." In actual fact, when measured as to costs, as to the number of our men engaged in the combat area, and as to the current rate of casualties, it is already the third largest war in American history, and it is steadily getting larger. Second, our enemy is the total communist bloc of nations. Our Congress has not declared war against any nation. No nation has declared war on us, but the fighting is taking place between North Vietnam and the United States. The officials of Soviet Russia and of one communist regime after another have repeatedly declared their complete solidarity with North Vietnam, so that for all practical purposes, we are at war in Southeast Asia with Soviet Russia and its satellites all over the world. Third, at least 80% of the sinews of war are being provided North Vietnam by Soviet Russia and its European satellites. On May 24, 1965, Premier Pham Van Dong of North Vietnam said, quote, "We shall defeat the Americans with Soviet weapons," unquote. It was not an idle boast. Our Air Force Chief of Staff has called the communist defenses in North Vietnam, quote, "the greatest concentration of anti-aircraft weapons that has ever been known in the history of defense of any town or any area in the world," unquote. These installations and the training and supervision to make them effective have been provided by Soviet Russia. Here is a statement from the January 30th, 1967 edition of U.S. News and World Report. Quote, "The North Vietnamese war machine runs almost entirely on Russian oil. In the past 18 months, the Russians shipped in 300,000 tons. The Chinese provided almost none. Last month alone, the Soviets shipped nearly 25,000 metric tons of gasoline and oil into Haiphong," unquote. During the last months of 1966, the Soviet Union shipped 100 new MiG jet fighters to Hanoi, thus doubling the size of North Vietnam's Air Force. A full list of similar items would be almost endless. And now we come to the part of this story which at first glance seems so incredible, but which sufficient study proves to be an incontrovertible fact. It is that all of this help to North Vietnam in its war against ourselves is made possible by our help to the Soviet Union and its satellites. And we do not mean just help of a general nature to communist designs and activities all over the world, but specific direct help for the very purpose, or which might as well be, whatever the real intention, for the very purpose of having this help passed on to North Vietnam to enable it to carry on this war against us. Let's look first at just one sequence of events in support and illustration of so seemingly unbelievable an observation. On October 7, 1966, a speech by President Johnson to the National Conference of Editorial Writers included the following statements, quote, "We intend to press for legislative authority to negotiate trade agreements which could extend most favored nation tariff treatment to European communist states. And today I am announcing the following steps. We will reduce export controls on East-West trade with respect to hundreds of non-strategic items. I have just today signed a determination that will allow the Export-Import Bank to guarantee commercial credits to 4 additional Eastern European countries, Poland and Hungary, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. The Secretary of State is now reviewing the possibility of easing the burden of Polish debts to the United States. The Export-Import Bank is prepared to finance exports for the Soviet Italian Fiat auto plant. End of the quotation from the President's speech. This was not mere oratory. With regard to just one part of such comprehensive assistance to our enemies, enemies who have vowed to bury us, the New York Times reported 1 week later on October 13, quote, "The United States put into effect today one of President Johnson's proposals for stimulating East-West trade by removing restrictions on the export of more than 400 commodities to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Poland and Romania have been given special treatment, and in general, the result of today's measure will be to extend such treatment to the Soviet Union, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Albania, and Mongolia. Among the categories from which items have been selected for export relaxation are vegetables, cereals, fodder, hides, crude and manufactured rubber, pulp and waste paper, textiles and textile fibers, crude fertilizers, metal ores and scrap, petroleum, gas and derivatives, chemical compounds and products, dyes, medicines, fireworks, detergents, plastic materials, metal products and machinery, and scientific and professional instruments." And 2 weeks later, ladies and gentlemen, on October 27, 1966, this is about 3 weeks after the President's speech, you will notice, the Times informed us that, quote, "The Soviet Union and its allies agreed at the conference of their leaders in Moscow last week to grant North Vietnam assistance in material and money amounting to about $1 billion. Poland's contribution will be $30 million, it was said." End of quotations. The Soviets had correctly interpreted all of this contemplated additional trade with the United States as simply a subterfuge for aid to themselves. Through loans by the Export-Import Bank, the repeated scaling down or cancellation of previous loans of all kinds, and a general subsidization in the usual wide variety of forms. And they were quite quick to show their appreciation by promising to pass on to our enemies in North Vietnam this additional help which our aid to themselves would make possible. Now again, this is but a sample. We believe that with adequate space it could be demonstrated that many of these communist regimes would not even be able to maintain themselves in power, and much less to do their part in sustaining worldwide communist aggression, but for the constant transfusion into their systems of economic aid from the United States. Yet hundreds of our boys are now being killed in Vietnam every week, supposedly to prevent the aggression and advance of this communist octopus. Now let's try to get a better understanding of the whole picture by a closer look at one or two particular spots. And a good place to look first is into this question of food. It is not only true, as the Greeks said, that one must eat before one can philosophize, it is also true that one must eat at least a certain minimum of food with a certain degree of regularity if one is to work on the machines which turn out guns in an armament factory. And it is a further important truth that throughout all history, as a general rule and with only rare and temporary exceptions, people living in a communal society or a completely socialist economy have never been able to feed themselves. Whether the group was as small as the English settlements at Jamestown and Plymouth Rock or as large as the Soviet Empire, it has had to feed itself by begging, borrowing, or stealing from others. Or it has been forced in time by approaching starvation to abandon the socialist communist principle, as the Jamestown and Plymouth colonies did before it was too late. But of course the communist world, or the clique of insiders which rules it, simply cannot abandon the socialist framework for its economy, not at least until it has finished using both the pretended beauties and the crushing regimentation of socialism as a part of the elaborate means for establishing its tyranny over the whole population of the earth. So for Moscow, there has been no other choice but to beg, borrow, or steal from capitalist countries enough additional food for its satellites and dependencies, and even for Soviet Russia itself, to prevent the complete collapse of its economic system and hence of the various communist governments. Ever since the end of World War I, when the Hoover mission supplied tremendous quantities of American foodstuffs to relieve starvation among the slaves of the newly established Bolshevik regime, the United States has been coming periodically to the rescue of tottering communist governments with the food needed to keep them in business. Until today, this procedure has become so regular, so continuous, and so accepted that both the fact and its significance are largely overlooked. This is especially true when the massive aid from Washington to Moscow in the form of food from Moscow's slaves is wrapped up in so many disguises and maneuvers that almost nobody can tell exactly what is going on anyway. And the mystery created about American wheat shipments to the communist world during the past few years offers an excellent illustration of several points we are trying to make. When I was in Hong Kong last December, 1966, a friend of mine there, who is one of the best informed men on all aspects of the communist conspiracy that I have ever known, made to me a rather startling statement. He said that if the truth were known and you could run down all the facts and put together all the pieces of the puzzle, you would find that every third Russian was now eating American wheat. Now, I cannot substantiate any such statement and do not know whether it is true or even anywhere near true. But let's look at some of the things we do know, at some of the specific items we have been able to find in the records out of all this welter of monkey business connected with American wheat. And any consideration of the subject should begin with a recognition of these facts. 1. The Soviets are extremely sensitive to any suggestion that they may not be raising enough wheat even to feed their own people. 2. Soviet statistics are worth just as little as Soviet promises. And 3. Our government is full of people whose main business in life seems to be to import Soviet falsehoods into the United States and export American substance into Russia. As an illustration of that latter point, our USIA in Washington is right now engaged in a massive promotion for sale in this country of a communist magazine called Soviet Life. They made the mistake of sending me one of the broadsides advertising it. But let's go back to wheat, which is not quite so sickening. Early in 1963, Secretary of Agriculture Freeman, after an 18-day tour of the Soviet Union and its satellites, praised Soviet farm production and said, quote, "They have the ability to feed themselves," unquote. But by the early fall of 1963, the Kennedy administration was promoting a wheat deal with the Soviets. They claimed that such a deal would have many advantages for the United States. But the Bureau of Public Affairs, in explanation of the wheat deal, issued the following statement, quote, "Our country has always responded to requests for food from governments of people who needed it, so long as we were certain that the people would actually get it and know where it came from. The Russian people will know they are receiving American wheat. The United States has never had a policy against selling consumer goods, including agricultural commodities, to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe," unquote. Now you can imagine just how much chance our State Department would ever have or want of determining the distribution or the usage of any wheat received in the Soviet Union, or of how much chance there was that the Russian people would ever know where the wheat they were eating came from. But let that pass. For this pro-communist propaganda by our Bureau of Public Affairs contained one thought that was not in tune with the constantly changing communist line, namely that the Soviets could not feed themselves. So early in 1964, after the wheat had been shipped, incidentally, we began to hear the stories, supported by some reports from the Institute of German Industries in West Germany, that the real trouble had been a deficiency in the Soviet chemical industry, and that all of this American wheat was really needed as raw material for the manufacture of chemical products. Late in 1963, after the deal had all been made, and when Khrushchev spoke to the Supreme Soviet, He made no mention of hungry peoples needing to be fed by the West, but he welcomed help from the West to the sagging and backward Soviet chemical industry. Just why on earth we should help the chemical industry of our mortal enemies, even if we received gold for the wheat as was claimed, that's another question. But in any event, and regardless of the actual uses or intended uses of most of this wheat, a few facts did eventually come to light. Between January 6 and February 20th, 1964, according to a statement by the Department of Agriculture in March of 1964, we delivered to Soviet Russia over 65 million bushels of wheat. What the whole total of the deal was, I don't know, and I'm not sure that anybody else does. It is interesting to note, just in passing, however, that even this amount was equivalent to 1 bushel of wheat, or 60 pounds, for every third inhabitant, man, woman, or child, in Soviet Russia. But in October 1964, Undersecretary of State Ball spoke disparagingly of the amount of wheat we had shipped or were shipping to Russia as a drop in the bucket of the total Soviet requirements. That last phrase, quote, total Soviet requirements, unquote, does introduce a little light onto the subject, however. For Mother Moscow has to worry about all of her children getting fed too, either by the United States or by somebody. And we know that in 1964, the same year we shipped Russia this little drop in the bucket of over 65 million bushels, the Soviets were shipping wheat to Romania and to Cuba, which rather explodes the State Department's certainty that the Russian people would actually get the wheat and know where it came from. Or maybe we are to believe that the Soviets put written messages in Spanish with all of the wheat they shipped to Castro's Cuba, reading, "This wheat comes to you as a gift from the American people." And incidentally, don't let it surprise you any that Castro is among the beneficiaries of our government's policy of giving aid to our enemies. Just for a couple of tiny illustrations, through the so-called Special Fund of the United Nations, we covered 40% of the costs of an agricultural experimental station in communist Cuba. And through UNESCO, we continuously subsidize the University of Havana, which every year is turning out thousands of young communists determined to destroy our nation. But again, let's return to wheat. During 1965 and 1966, the United States was shipping wheat to Greece. But Greece, in turn, was shipping wheat to 2 hungry members of the communist family, namely North Korea and Bulgaria. At the same time, incidentally, the United States was sending corn to Brazil, from which country corn was being shipped to Cuba. You must remember that all of these carefully hidden arrangements have to be laboriously dug out by somebody, usually a patriotic congressman. Just as was the fact finally dug out and exposed 4 years ago that 24 million bushels of wheat, which the United States had shipped to and for Austria, got diverted somehow in transit and was actually delivered to East Germany and Czechoslovakia. What Dr. Gannon of our research department calls this game of musical chairs with wheat both clarifies the mystery and at the same time adds to the confusion of what is going on. And it may help to explain this next item. In March 1965, our government completed an agreement to send 25 million bushels of wheat to Yugoslavia. A similar agreement for the same amount was made in November 1965. The total would come to approximately 4 bushels or 240 pounds of wheat in 1 year for every man, woman, and child in Tito's domain. And if you can believe that all of this wheat stayed in Yugoslavia, or was ever intended to stay in Yugoslavia, then you can also believe that of the $2.5 to $3 billion of money and materials which our government has given Tito, you can believe that none of it went directly into the hands of his bosses in the Kremlin. Or you can believe that the $1 billion worth of actual war materials which we shipped to the communist government of India 3 or 4 years ago was either used or intended for use in repelling a temporary border raid on India by the Red Chinese. In the early stages of this largesse, we were shipping $10 million worth of trucks and other, quote, war materials, unquote, per week to India by air in flying boxcars from Frankfurt, Germany. The whole maneuver, of course, was made possible and supposedly plausible by the pretense that Soviet Russia, the great friend and protector of India, was engaged in a phony rift, or this phony rift with the Red Chinese. Just where the Soviets actually wanted to use this $1 billion worth of American equipment, or where it was finally sent, probably nobody knows except the Kremlin and its allies in our State Department. The trucks that are now hauling ammunition over the Ho Chi Minh Trail to kill our boys in Vietnam could very easily be out of these very shipments. However, to return to wheat once more, we might mention in passing the recent news that those two great allies and buddies in philanthropy, the United States and Soviet Russia, both announced huge forthcoming shipments of wheat to India, 900,000 tons for the United States and 200,000 tons from the Soviets. Since it is customary for these diplomatic Santa Clauses in Washington to announce their agreements and talk about their shipments of wheat half of the time in tons and half of the time in bushels, simply to add to the confusion, let me translate again as I have been doing up to now. There are 33 1/3 bushels of wheat to an American ton and approximately 37 bushels to a metric ton. And further traps are laid for the unwary in quoting government statistics by the fact that you never know whether a reference is to metric tons or American tons. But in any event, the quantities involved here are about 31 million bushels from the United States and about 7 million bushels from the Soviets. And even if the latter amount, the 7 million bushels from the Soviets, ever gets shipped anywhere except in newspaper headlines, it is worth noting that the Soviet consignment of wheat to India equals approximately 15% of the wheat that the United States consigned to just one Soviet satellite, Yugoslavia, in 1965. It is further worth noting also that the amount quoted here for the United States to send to India was really only a very small fraction of the total to which our government has committed us as aid to India within the next year or a little more, and apparently was put down at this quantity to make the Russian contribution at least not look so negligible by comparison. Here is a nice, heartwarming item which shows the real nobility of our would-be allies in the Kremlin. Among other Soviet satellites and dependencies to which we have regularly been shipping wheat for years is Afghanistan. Those shipments have steadily increased until last year we sent that small country 150,000 tons. That is 5 million bushels. And in June 1966, Mr. Joe McGowan, Jr. of Associated Press reported from Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, as follows, quote, American gift wheat reaching Kabul goes into a Soviet-built silo and bakery. It comes out for sale under the popularly accepted name Russian bread. A United States Embassy official said this was not regarded as a propaganda advantage for the Soviet Union because the people know wheat is coming from the United States. A sample survey at a bread stall showed that only a couple of businessmen in Western-style suits knew about American grain shipments. With 95% of the people illiterate, newspaper stories don't have much impact. Word of mouth has established the bread as Russian. Any comment seems superfluous, except that perhaps I did not hear my friend in Hong Kong right. Maybe what he said was that every third person, not just in the Soviet Union, but in the whole Soviet Empire, was now eating American wheat. For this annual largesse to Afghanistan is enough to give every third man, woman, and child in that country approximately 75 pounds of American wheat per year. In July 1965, the Alan Scott Report pointed out that our good friend Abdel Gamal Nasser of Egypt was shipping rice and Soviet arms to communist Cuba in direct and deliberate violation of U.S. Public Law number 488, and that this action coincided exactly with President Johnson's authorization of shipments of United States wheat to Nasser's government in Egypt. There is practically no end to the list of such idiocies or worse, which might be compiled. But we think that the whole situation can be summed up by, and we'll rest our case with regard to wheat with, a dispatch from Poland, first carried in Die Vermerkte Zeitung of Hamburg, Germany, and then reprinted on December 26, 1966 in the Chicago Tribune. We should all be grateful to Dean Clarence Mannion for having publicized this revealing item on the Manion Forum. It reads as follows, quote, "Weapons of the Polish armed forces are being shipped from Stettin Harbor in Poland in ever-increasing quantities to North Vietnam harbors. While on one side of the Stettin Harbor, American wheat is being unloaded from freighters, on the other side of the same harbor, weapons are loaded which are being used against American soldiers. The Poles receive the wheat from the United States on credit, and they in turn ship their weapons to North Vietnam on credit," unquote. And if Washington can give aid and comfort to our enemies in any plainer fashion than that, we don't know how. We are bound to agree with that great American Ezra Taft Benson, who is always slow to anger and restrained in his statements. But in his speech before the Freedom Club of Los Angeles on Tuesday, February 7, Secretary Benson spoke of, quote, "what appears to be a deliberate and determined effort to provide our enemies with the means to kill our sons," unquote. What else can you call it? And how long are the American people going to allow this idiocy, or worse, to be continued? But please do not think that our help to our enemies is limited to feeding them. In fact, that is probably a comparatively minor part of the act. As Tom Anderson has pointed out, our State Department has made Russia, so far as the Soviet regime has any strength or substance at all. We have been steadily exporting factories, food, equipment, and American know-how to Russia and her satellites. Right now, as Congressman Glenn Lipscomb pointed out in a speech which appeared in the Congressional Record for October 17, 1966, a whole vast new automobile industry is being established in Russia for the Soviets, technically or theoretically by the Fiat Company of Italy. But, as Lipscomb quoted from Forbes magazine, quote, "3/4 of the machinery that Fiat installs for the Russians will come from the United States, either directly or indirectly through European subsidiaries and licensees of American firms. It will really be the United States that puts the Russians on wheels," unquote. And just to make all of this official policy, on October 7, 1966, President Johnson announced the Export-Import Bank is prepared to finance exports for the Soviet-Italian Fiat auto plant, unquote. It is no wonder that, as John Stormer reminded us, on September 27, 1965, Soviet Premier Kosygin told the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party that hope for the Soviet Union lay in making, quote, "wider use of foreign technology," unquote. And Dr. Werner Keller, author of the great book The Bible is History, was quite correct in his more recent book, East minus West equals zero, when he stated, quote, "the present position of Russia, had she not been taught, helped, and supported by the West, would be unthinkable. Even at this moment, Russia can only keep up by the continuous theft and exploitation of every new development in the free world," unquote. Especially with regard to American technical and industrial knowledge, there seems to be no limit to the determination of successive administrations in Washington to teach our Soviet enemies everything we know and give them our every secret. In the current April issue of American Opinion, Dr. Medford Evans has just established beyond any doubt that the Roosevelt regime gave the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union and in fact kept the Soviets fully advised on our progress in connection with this greatest of all military secrets from the very beginning. And there has been no change in this policy since. The first so-called cultural exchange with the Soviet Union was initiated by President Eisenhower in January of 1958, only 14 months after Khrushchev's bloody subjugation of Hungary. The public has had the impression all of this time that these arrangements, which are deliberately and deceptively labeled cultural exchange, mainly deal with the trips of symphony orchestras, ballet companies, and similar entertainment. But nothing could be further from the truth. The real meat of the scheme lies in the fields of science, technology, and industry. Let's look briefly at the fifth such exchange agreement, which was released by the State Department about the 1st of April, 1966. A part of the text read as follows, quote, both parties agree to provide exchanges of 5 to 6 persons, which number may be increased by mutual agreement, for periods of 3 to 4 weeks for the purpose of familiarization and exchange of experience in the following fields. 1. Gas industry, the design, construction, and exploitation of gas and gas condensation deposits, construction and operation of storage facilities for gas and gas deposits, exploration for helium, and the extraction of helium from natural gas. Parenthetically, let me say, since the United States government had come to consider helium as so important a critical defense resource that it was already producing helium from 5 plants operated by the Bureau of Mines of the Interior Department, you can readily imagine how little we had to learn from this exchange and how much we had to give. Returning to the agreement and the items on which all this experience and knowledge were to be exchanged, number 2, high voltage transmission of electricity, and I'll skip the elaboration. Number 6, sulfur production, a study of the organization and technology of producing and refining sulfur, including visits to mines, refineries, and dispatching centers. Number 8, cartography, a study of the compilation, revision, reproduction, and distribution of maps and charts, including use of photogrammetric methods. 11, electronic telephone and telegraph communications, familiarization with production and operation of electronic wired telephone and telegraph communication systems. Number 12, please note, metallurgy, smelting of ferrous metals, production of hot and cold rolled steel, pipes and metal products, and products of heat-resisting alloys, including visits to research centers for study of scientific methods in metallurgical industry and thermomechanical processing. That's the end of the quotation from the agreement. There are other items in this list which are quite revealing, but that's all for which we can spare the room. It is obvious that every area covered is of great military significance to the chief supplier of military equipment and technical supervision to our enemies who are daily killing American soldiers in Vietnam. And it is interesting to note that this cultural exchange agreement was released and confirmed just 2 weeks after the Soviet Union had sent a letter to the communist parties all over the world which included the following paragraph, quote, the Soviet Union delivers to the DRV, that's North Vietnam, to the DRV a great quantity of weapons, among them rocket installations, anti-aircraft artillery, airplanes, tanks, coastal defenses, warship, and others. In the year 1965 alone, weapons and other war material worth about 500 million rubles, and remember that's well over $500 million, worth about 500 million rubles was placed at the disposal of the DRV, North Vietnam. The DRV receives support through the training of pilots, missile personnel, tank drivers, artillerymen, and so on. Our military help, this is the Soviet Union still talking to the other communist parties all over the world, our military help is supplied in the quantities which the Vietnamese leadership itself considers necessary. End of the quotation. Now the question arises, of course, as to how anybody on earth can even attempt to justify such actions on the part of our government. But they do, and here is one example. It is, as you might expect, by C.L. Sulzberger, and it appeared in the New York Times on January 16, 1966. Quote, the two superpowers, both eager to avoid world war and worried about China, are simultaneously thus both explicit enemies and implicit allies. This is a most intricate and subtle relationship, and for the sake of all concerned, it must remain precisely that. End of quotation. Which means, as Sam Blumenfeld explained very lucidly in the Review of the News last April 1966, that in the supposed struggle between the Russian communists and the Chinese communists, we must take the side of the Russian communists, although we have been spending over $50 billion per year ostensibly to protect ourselves from them. Just why, Sam remarks, we do not simply stand on the sidelines and watch the Russian communists and the Chinese communists kill each other off, nobody has explained. And just one grand result of any such development, the caustic Mr. Blumenfeld himself explains, is that Robert Strange McNamara would undoubtedly wind up back in Detroit again, still making lemons. Seriously, the Sulzberger statement is, to put it in the properly exalted and refined language, a clever concoction of deliberately deceptive hogwash. And it is not made any the less so by being the official Moscow-Washington line. In fact, this whole concept, as confirmed by President Johnson in January 1967 in his State of the Union message, can only be compared for brazen audacity with the pretense of the emperor and all of his courtiers in the old fable that the unrobed emperor was wearing such beautiful clothes. It took a simple child to exclaim finally with straightforward truth, "Why, the emperor is naked." All of this specious sophistry about the very delicate situation which must be handled with such care, in which we are at war with the Soviets on one side of the world but friends and allies on the other side, is as big a fraud as is the painstakingly built-up pretense about a growing rift between Peking and Moscow. All you need is the direct vision and objective common sense of any child to see that the whole thing is a gigantic hoax. No such arrangement, as Sulzberger describes, is in fact possible or believable, and the pretense is simply a part of the game. The game itself is intricate and subtle, all right. It is a shell game in which the tongues of the barkers are quicker than the senses of the audience. In The Truth About Vietnam, we have tried to make clear some of the strategy and the purposes of these players who pretend to be opposing each other. We cannot repeat that discussion here, but let us simply point out a few facts which seem to me to be obvious for anybody who dares to be realistic. 1. The administration has no slightest intention or desire to win this war, nor to end it, but only to make it larger and longer and a more overwhelming obsession in the minds of the American people. All the motions and statements, and this includes the truces they have had and the truces they will have in the future, probably some of them much longer for political or other purposes, and they're just part of the game. All the motions and statements, including the truces, which indicate a search for peace, are, in my opinion, as phony as the way the war is being conducted. Number 2, the Soviet Union has no more interest in winning this war than does the administration in Washington. Both want simply to keep it going and growing to serve other purposes. The Soviet Union is supplying North Vietnam all of the material help and technical supervision and strategic guidance needed to make of the war a realistic show. Number 3, the United States is actually paying the bills and supplying the war materials directly or indirectly for both sides of this war. It was not without considerable justification that the Richmond News Leader stated in its scathing editorial of November 2nd, 1966, quote, "Every communist bullet that tears into American flesh in Vietnam bears the brand of LBJ," unquote. 4, to keep the show even superficially plausible, if no longer convincing to anybody who will use the common sense he was born with, the American armed services are compelled to fight with the same kind of handicaps and restrictions imposed on them that MacArthur said in the Korean War were up to that time without precedent in American history, and, so far as he knew, in the history of the world. 5, the ultimate purpose of the insiders who are running the show and pulling the strings, at the ends of which both Moscow and Washington are being manipulated like a couple of puppets, is gradually to convert the Vietnam affair into a full-scale Third World War. The Soviets, after having set the stage and made all the initial preparations for the Red Chinese, and while still directing the actors and the action on the communist side from behind the scenes, will gradually increase their pretense of having broken with the Red Chinese, will nestle up closer to the United States as our allies, and will help to lead us, will use their supposed influence with both sides to lead us all into communist-style peace under the rulership of a communist-run United Nations. Number 6, in the meantime, at first thousands and presently tens of thousands of American boys will be killed by bullets and bombs and missiles from guns and planes and installations made possible by the unceasing aid of Washington to our mortal enemies, of which we have been able to give you only a few illustrative examples during the brief survey which was practicable in this speech. Ever since 1945, ladies and gentlemen, one administration in Washington after another has been helping the communists, has in fact been the greatest single force in enabling the communists to impose their tyranny on one country after another. Albany, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, China, North Korea, Mongolia, Manchuria, Tibet, North Vietnam, Indonesia, Ghana, the Congo, Cuba, and many more. The list goes on and on. But now these same forces in Washington are visibly making their long-expected moves towards imposing the same brutal tyranny on the American people, and, in plain language, are playing the American people for a bunch of gullible suckers as a means of doing so. And it's time to tell them, in no uncertain terms, you can't get away with it. To come out where we started, let us emphasize that the very first thing to be done to make good on this declaration that they can't get away with it is to put a stop to all of this aid to our enemies. For that purpose, we have prepared a petition to the American Congress. It begins, we respectfully urge every member of the House of Representatives and both the Senate and the House as a whole to exert their authority and use their influence in all honorable ways for the following purpose: to have this administration stop, promptly and completely, giving aid in any form, directly or indirectly, to our communist enemies. Copies of the petition are available at 50 for $1 postpaid from the Review of the News, Belmont, Massachusetts, 02178. That's the Review of the News, Belmont, Massachusetts, 02178. We hope, need, and expect to make this the most massive plea by petition ever directed at the American Congress. Whether we can do so or not will be largely up to you, and the lives you save by helping us may well include your own. Thank you. Thank you.